Kierner from George Mason and her wonderful book. But before then, as you know, I have some housekeeping to do. We have a very busy month, and so I have to share all the events we're happening just in this month. Usually I talk about 2 or 3 months, but April is an extremely busy month for us. So some things that you all should be aware of. Next week on April the 3rd, we're having a really exciting lunch at the library here. That's April the 3rd, lunchtime talk. We're bringing in a group at Shenandoah University that has a virtual reality lab. And they have created a virtual reality experience of the Constitutional Convention that is aimed at K-12 classes. They partnered with the National Park Service and the National Constitution Center to recreate the Constitutional Convention, and you can walk through it. I experienced it. I went there a skeptic. I walked out blown away and telling them they have to come here and share their work with everybody. So that's going to be at lunchtime on April the 3rd. They're going to talk about the project. They're going to show it on the screen, and then for those that want to stay longer, they're going to let people experience it themselves in other rooms. So that's April the 3rd. Then we're going to do a brown bag on April the 8th. So the next week, on one of our fellows is going to present on his work. It's Edward Greene, and his project is called Power, Diplomacy, and Interdependent Sovereignty in the Choctaw Nation, 1720 to 1924. So it's going to be looking at early Indian U.S. federal relations during Washington's administration. And then on April the 11th, I told you we had a lot coming up, is the second of our 3 Michelle Smith lecture series, where we're having Pulitzer Prize winner H.W. Brands come talk about his new book, Founding Partisans, to talk about how partisanship is not something that's new to the American experience. And then finally, on April 23rd, we have our next Forward Evening Book Talk, and that is former fellow Christopher Minty for his new book, Unfriendly to Liberty, The Loyalist Networks and the Coming of the American Revolution in New York City. But we're here tonight on the cusp of April, at the end of April, to welcome our neighbor and friend, Cynthia Kierner. And Cynthia, do you go by Cynthia or Cindy?
Cindy.
Cindy,
Yep.
Okay. Many of you probably know Cindy. She's a professor at George Mason University. She's written a book that I've referred to regularly in my own work, Martha Jefferson Randolph, Daughter of Monticello, Her Life and Times. It is a wonderful book. Again, I have used it extensively in my own research, and it was also a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize here at Mount Vernon. Also, Scandal at Bazaar. My eyes are going. Once I turned 45, I all of a sudden, pardon me? Yeah, I know your magnifying glasses start going from 1.25 to the next thing you know. Rumor and Reputation in Jefferson's America and Inventing Disaster, the Culture of Calamity from the Jamestown Colony to the Johnstown Flood. Professor Kierner is an OAH Distinguished Lecturer and past president of the Southern Association for Women's Historians. She's received research support and fellowships from a number of different institutions, including the Virginia Historical Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the American Antiquarian Society, and the National Endowment for Humanities, and, of course, also here at Mount Vernon. So she has been a fellow 2 times.
No, the second one is coming up.
Okay,
coming up. I'll be back.
To be.
I'll be back.
And so she's here to talk about her wonderful book, which I just can't tell you how much I enjoyed reading, The Tory's Wife, A Women and Her Family in Revolutionary America. Yeah.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And this is where the project actually started. I wrote my first chapter here because I thought it would be full of people who know about military history, which I don't know about. Unfortunately, it was January 2021, and it was full of no one. So, but the books were super cool, and they are not books that I would have had access to otherwise.
That's great. And we're looking forward to having you back.
Looking forward to being back.
Yeah. Well, actually, maybe we can back up because you may have written your first chapter here in January of 2021, but if I understand, the book began somewhat unexpectedly even before then. So could you maybe share with us how you came to write this book, and then we'll dive into what it has to say?
Yeah. So like way back in the 1990s, I wanted to write a book about Southern women during the American Revolutionary period, because no one had really done that. And I got the idea from reading work from other scholars that if you really wanted to find the voices of women, particularly women who weren't attached to famous men, the place you go is legislative petitions. everyone had the right to petition the legislature. And when you petition the legislature, you're basically asking the government for help. And in order to sort of convince them that they should give you help, you need to tell like a whole long detailed story, in your own voice and explaining your situation and your experiences. And so I thought this would be a really great way to find women's voices. And what I was hoping to find was women saying things like, hey, it's a revolution. I'm a citizen. I want rights. That would have been awesome. But like, they were like a lot smarter than I was, because they knew that to get the government to help them, it would have been much smarter to be like, oh, I'm a poor, helpless, frail woman. Please help me. And so like the woman that I write about in this book is pretty much the only one who doesn't do that. She is pretty much the only one who does use words like citizen and rights, and I thought she was awesome because of that. And I thought about her for a very long time, and never really did anything with her, but knew that I wanted to write something about her. And lo and behold, the pandemic. How much Netflix can you watch, right? So it's kind of like, I'm going to look for Jane on the internet. I'm going to see what I can find. And I didn't find very much, but in the process of looking, I think I thought long and deep about her petitions and about her situation in North Carolina. And and so that's how I came to the project. And I feel like that this is like a book that in some ways almost wrote itself, because I was thinking about it for so long. It's good to think. I don't often do that. I kind of like to just get things done, but it's good to think. And this is weird.
Yeah, no, there's an echo.
It's super weird.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good.
All right.
Yeah.
I feel very loud now.
I know.
Patrick! The Wizard of Oz or something behind that. So, but that's great. Do you want to share with everybody we're going to dive into the book, but maybe just a top-level summary of the Spurgeon's
Yes.
story?
Yeah. Okay, so they live in the North Carolina. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm really loud. They live in the North Carolina backcountry, which is kind of like a frontier area. They travel down from Maryland and Virginia, where they live initially, and they settle in Rowan County, North Carolina. And when the war happens, William, Jane's husband, decides that he's going to remain loyal to the king. And there are probably a lot of reasons for this. I mean, unfortunately, he never says, I'm going to remain loyal to the king, and here's exactly why. But he remains loyal to the king. Not only does he remain loyal to the king, he fights in the Tory militia. So he is actually fighting for the crown during the entire war, whereas Jane supports the revolution, and she is at home. After the war is over, basically they are separate. I don't know if their separation was consensual or if it was angry or whatever, but William eventually goes off to Canada with another man's wife, and Jane stays in North Carolina, where she dies in 1803.
So it was a fascinating read with many twists and turns, and I have to say it was one of those that you don't get emotional when you read a lot of history books, but this one did give me. I had an emotional reaction, especially later on into it. So, and what was great about the book also is how you use this story of two people as a window, not only into their own lives and experiences, but more generally forces that were shaping history at the time. So I wanted to start maybe in the very beginning of the Spurgeon's, did I get it right that time?
Yep.
Story. How did the Spurgeons get to America? Why were they here in the first place? And what was this phenomenon that brought them here?
Okay, well, unlike most of the people who are living in this part of North Carolina who were either Scotch, Irish, or German, the Spurgeons are of English ancestry, and their respective grandparents are the ones who come over from England, go first to Pennsylvania, then move to Maryland, then move to Virginia, and eventually in North Carolina. Jane's grandparents are just sort of garden variety English immigrants. We don't know a whole lot about them. Williams have a kind of sexier story. His grandfather came to Maryland as convict labor, and he was convicted of stealing laundry out of someone's yard in London. And so there are actually records about this in the Old Bailey. And basically, if you were convicted of that sort of crime, you could, like, I don't know, have an ear cut off or something horrible, or you could go to Maryland. And I mean, he's like, well, dude, I think I'm going to go to Maryland, and gets on a boat full of convict labor, and he and his brother actually come together. They're both convicted, and they end up, if you came as convict labor, you worked for a period of time, and then you got to be free. And what's really interesting is that most people who came to America as convict labor really did not do terribly well for themselves. I mean, they kept their ears and their other body parts, which is like a really good thing, obviously. But they're not terribly successful. These two were. They ended up owning land, not a lot of land, but owning some land. And so that's how they get to the colonies.
Yeah, and this is actually an example of how digital resources really allowed this project to happen, because I think Old Bailey's has now been digitized and keyword searchable?
Yes, absolutely. And it was actually done by my former colleague, or one of the leaders of the project, my former colleague at George Mason, a guy named Dan Cohen. And so that's exactly what I mean. I'm looking at the records of the Old Bailey, which are in London during the pandemic, in my sweatpants. And it's a great way to do research.
Yeah. Great. So Jane and William in North Carolina, do you have any sense on how they met? What that early life was like, and then, when they had a farm, what were their different roles, do you suspect, day to day?
Well, they met when they were in Maryland, and they, when these people came down the Great Wagon Road, they often came in like large extended family groups, or even they come with their neighbors or whatever. I mean, this idea of, rugged individualism, that certainly not an 18th century sort of thing. They travel in groups. So they were already married when they came to North Carolina. They come to North Carolina because the land is a lot cheaper. The downside of the land being a lot cheaper, right, is that it's not cleared. And so the first thing that they have to do when they get to North Carolina, they and their neighbors, is clear all this land. And then once the land is cleared, there is kind of more of a gender division of labor where the men are growing and selling the crops, and the women are doing things like dairying and planting and orchards and making cider and things like that. And so, everybody's working, but different people are doing different things according to their age, according to their gender, though I think it would be kind of wrong to say that that's like always the case. For instance, during harvest time, everybody is harvesting. It doesn't matter if you're a woman or you're a kid or whatever. So there is some overlap in terms of the work that's going on in the farm.
And William really establishes himself within the community, serving on the county court, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, he becomes a justice of the peace, which in counties, as opposed to like in towns, right? In the 18th century, the justices of the peace are basically the local government. And in Rowan County, there are about 20 of them. He gets himself appointed. This is a royal appointment. He's appointed by the royal governor. And that might have been one of the reasons why he remains loyal to the king. You take an oath and you swear to uphold the king's laws. Now, the other 19 guys who were justices of the peace were kind of like, nah, that oath doesn't count anymore. But he apparently thought that it did. But he becomes, by virtue of being a justice of the peace, he becomes an important man in Rowan County. Although among the justices, he is probably among the, I don't want to say poorest, but he's got 700 acres. He might have one enslaved man working for him. Some of the other justices had much, much more land, and also many more enslaved people working on their property.
Yeah. Oh, no, if I remember.
No, so he's important, but he's not like, by any chance, by any stretch of the imagination, like ridiculously wealthy, the way we tend to think of, Southern planters.
Yeah, when you were talking, I was reminded of a story, if I remember correctly, when it did come time to the revolution and independence, all of his other justices called him out in a resolve or something like that. Is that, am I remembering
Yeah,
that right?
well, I mean, so like at some point the county court, which is and the county justices, which are royally appointed, kind of cease to function, and local government morphs into something that they call the Committee of Safety. Which sounds very revolutionary, and it is very revolutionary, but there are a lot of the same guys. And it was really important for the revolutionaries to kind of sort out the people who supported their movement and separate them from the people who didn't. And when they figured out who the people were who didn't support the revolutionary movement, they wanted to punish those people. Either to get them to go along with the revolutionary movement or to sort of make them an example of this is what you do if you dissent, if you don't conform. And so the way they do that is they make people swear an oath. And William refuses to swear the oath to the revolution and later to the state of North Carolina. And in return for that, the Committee of Safety calls him, and I'm quoting, an enemy to his country, which, I mean, just kind of sounds like kind of insulting. But what it really meant was that if someone is labeled an enemy to his country, you, as a good patriotic person, should not be associating with him. You should not be buying his wheat. You should not be hanging out at the tavern with him. You should not be, he's an enemy. You shouldn't be associating with him. And so it really was kind of a big deal that they did that.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk about an event that has always interested me. And it's an event that happened in North Carolina that not many people, I feel like, know about. We all know about the Sons of Liberty. We all know about the Tea Party and the Boston Massacre. But in the backwoods of North Carolina, there was a major political movement called the Regulators. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about the Regulators and, more interestingly, how it intersects with both William and Jane's life?
Yeah, so the Regulators, while people in Philadelphia and Boston and New York and even places like Wilmington, North Carolina, are getting upset and having riots about like the Stamp Act and all that stuff, people in Western North Carolina are much more concerned with the Regulators. And the Regulators were farmers in counties like Rowan who were just really, really angry at the local government, these justices of the peace that I talked about. And the reason why they were angry at them is because most of them were corrupt as all hell. That's one of the reasons why they had all the land and all the slaves. They charged like fees for services that they never did. They, said that they were going to file land titles for people who bought property, and they never did that. They were just like really horrible, corrupt people, and a lot of them were people who, like this one guy lived in Maryland. He was in debtor's prison. He was a total loser. He's like, I'm going to go to North Carolina and make some real money, and that's kind of the way they do that. So the Regulators, they protest, they petition, they do all sorts of, peaceful things to sort of get their point across, none of which works. But every time, like, the local authorities would come and try to harass local farmers, like, for instance, they try to confiscate this one guy's cow because supposedly he didn't pay fees that he was supposed to pay. So the Regulators, they all get together to protect the guy and to protect his cow. And ultimately, all of this leads to a battle at Alamance, which is, I think, it's not in Rowan County, but it's in that part of North Carolina. And you can even see today that there is a seriously misguided monument to that battle. I mean, everything on the plaque is like made up and wrong, but it's in my book. I mean, they're just making this stuff up. But so the Battle of Alamance happens in 1771, and the Regulators are brutally repressed by North Carolina militia who were called out by the governor. And I mean, it's really important to note that even though it's the royal governor calling out the militia, it's North Carolinians that show up with the guns and suppress the Regulators. And I don't exactly know, like, William never came out and said, hey, I support the Regulators. That would have been like suicide for him to do that when everyone who holds political office in the state is basically, these guys are bad, we need to do something about them. But he is never one of the justices of the peace that is mentioned by name by the regulators as being like a bad guy. He is also not someone who got wealthy by being a justice of the peace, unlike a lot of these other people did. And two of Jane's brothers were fairly prominent in the Regulator movement, so these would have been William's brothers-in-law. In fact, one of them was supposed to be like executed for his role in the movement, but he somehow managed to get out of that, and he wasn't executed. And so I think that Jane and William were quietly supportive of the Regulators. And the really interesting thing is, so like if you go to North Carolina and you see this monument, it's like an obelisk, and it talks about how, you know, the Battle of Alamance is the first battle of the American Revolution, and these guys are like North Carolinians fighting the British. And it's like totally wrong. I mean, totally wrong. And one of the really interesting things is that, I mean, at least in Rowan County, all of the justices of the peace, except for William, end up either supporting or not opposing the revolution. And as far as I can tell, the overwhelming majority of the Regulators, some of them oppose it, but most of them just want to be left alone. They certainly don't want to support a movement that's being led by these people who made their lives so difficult for so long.
Yeah, no, that's always been the challenge, is to figure out, does the Regulator movement have anything to do with the revolution,
Right.
or is it a totally separate event that is just happening at the same time as all these other processes that are clearly leading to independence? And that it's, you know, it was fascinating to read about in your book, because you can't help but think about what then happens to William and Jane in the American Revolution, and whether or not the Regulators gave you any hint of what might happen. And it's interesting that they both appeared to have supported the Regulators. That's what the circumstantial
Right.
evidence leads to. But then when it came to independence, they went two very different ways. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I mean, so like their politics are very different. I mean, one of the very best sources that I used was a 19th century history of North Carolina written by this guy named Eli Washington Carruthers. And he was a clergyman. And at some point in the 1840s, he decided that he wanted to write a book about the American Revolution in North Carolina. He was from Rowan County, and so that was the area that he was really interested in. He wanted to write about people's lived experiences, not like, you know, what the government did and stuff like that. So how do you do that? Well, Eli W. Carruthers decided that the best way to do that was to go around looking for old people and talk to them. It's like, you look super old. Do you remember the revolution? And so this is what he does. Hey, this is oral history. People are doing it a long time before they start calling it that. And so, like, one of the people that he interviews says that they remember that Jane was as big a Whig as her husband was a Tory. And so, like, at least one person remembered that and said it, and it got into Carruthers' book. I don't know exactly when they came to this sort of irreconcilable political division. Now, we know William is a Tory from day one. He's an enemy to his country. He's off fighting with the loyalist militia. He's at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in 1776. He basically spends most of the war hiding out in the woods, you know, so like the Whigs don't get him and everything. He's away from home most of the time. Jane is at home. And we don't really know anything of her politics because they don't make women take oaths. They assume women either don't know or don't care about politics, so women don't have to take oaths. The first sort of direct evidence we have of her politics comes in 1781, so the war is almost over. And at that point, the backcountry of North Carolina is like the military theater where like all this stuff is happening. And so Nathanael Greene shows up with his army. And Jane's like, hey, Nate, come stay at my house. And so Nathanael Greene is staying at her house, which is like quite a show of sort of, you know, attachment to the patriot cause. The very same moment, William's about 2 miles away in an encampment with Cornwallis and the British Army and militia and all that. And so, like, from that, it kind of leads you to believe that, hey, maybe they're not going to live happily ever after this. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse happens not long after that. Jane actually volunteers one of her sons to be a scout for Nathanael Greene. So by 1781, we know that their politics are different. And the other way that we know that their politics are different is in these petitions that she files, where she says repeatedly, I'm not like my husband. He made some bad political choices, but I didn't, and I'm different.
Except there is this one tantalizing event that happens in the middle of the war, and I might get the year wrong, but I think it was 1782 that William returned home.
He returns home a couple of times because Jane has 2 babies during the war, and they end up with a total of 13 children, right? Yeah, okay. Oh my God. And William actually has a 14th child in 1787, but not with Jane. So he wasn't home then. He comes home periodically, and I mean, I think one of the differences, right, is that he's in the militia. He's not in the British Army. So if he were in the British Army, he would have to go wherever Cornwallis or whoever told him to go. These guys in the militia in the Carolinas, and to a lesser extent in Virginia, upstate New York would certainly be another place where this would have happened. They're like sort of running around in their little militia companies, doing raids, doing skirmishes against Whig militia. So he's always kind of around. And occasionally he shows up at home. I mean, I would love to know whether when he shows up at home, she's like happy to see him or she's like, get out, I mean, they're gonna come attack us if you're here. I don't want to see your ugly face. But they have 2 children during the war. And interestingly, the first one is born, I think, in 1778. And his name is Josiah. He's named after the last royal governor of North Carolina, Josiah Martin. And then the last son is born in, I think, 1780.
Okay.
So yeah, he does come home.
Yeah. So take us to what you think the experience was like for somebody like Jane in the backcountry of North Carolina. We have William in a loyalist militia, kind of roaming around in the woods, getting into skirmishes and harassing others. What is Jane's life like?
I think anyone's life in that time and place would have been just horrifically bad. Like if you Google battles of the American Revolution, or you have a book about the revolution that has all the battles that are like proper nouns with like capital letters and all of that, that's not what we're talking about here. There is fighting going on pretty much constantly, even though there's not a major battle anywhere in North Carolina between 1776 and 1780. For those 4 years, though, there is tons of fighting. There are skirmishes, there are raids, most of which don't have names, some of which have names, but they're like so obscure that you basically have to find a reenactor to learn anything about them. And so it's this really kind of like grassroots war that can pop up anytime, any place. And again, this is where, like people like E.W. Carruthers are really helpful. He's got stories in his book about, there's this one story that of a raid that happens near the Spurgeon's house, doesn't involve them, that a bunch of Tories, they have a neighbor who's a Whig, and who knows, maybe they've hated these people for years, or maybe it is just politics. They go and they attack them. And one of the things they do is they steal all this cloth that the family had been making homespun, and sort of take it with them. Well, that family who gets attacked, they get all their Whig friends. And they're like, okay, fine, we're going to go attack our Tory neighbors. And so like this violence doesn't really have any name, it's not the battle of something, but it's kind of going on all the time. Jane in her petitions actually talks about being repeatedly harassed by soldiers. I don't know if they're like real soldiers, like Continental soldiers, or they're these militia people, who want food, who want, whatever. She talks about her family being on the verge of starvation for a lot of the war because of that. And then, of course, women are, vulnerable to special kinds of violence, to rape and things like that. I mean, I don't get the impression that anything like that happened to her, but it did happen. And, it must have been just terrifying.
Yeah. I couldn't help but thinking about the fear for 4 years, and also knowing that your husband is on the other side of that, and how that might reflect on you, even if your beliefs are Whig, how the Whigs might look at your home, as you said. So I can't imagine the how she felt throughout this entire experience. The jam she really must have felt like she was in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you're a Whig, but do the Whigs really believe you're a Whig, or are they going to attack you because they know your husband's a Tory? Or are the Tories going to attack you because they know you're a Whig? It's just, yeah.
So now you opened a door that I was going to maybe go down later, but just to play the contrarian, is there a chance that Jane was in fact a Tory, and that her, later, statements of, support for the revolution was, as we'll get to, an attempt to secure funds for her family?
Yeah, I guess there's always a chance. In a way, I'd almost kind of like her better if she was a Tory, because she was super smart if she was a Tory. She totally knew how to play it. I don't think so, though. And I guess I don't think so for two main reasons. First of all, that oral history we have from the Carruthers book, where her neighbors remember her as being as big a Whig as he was a Tory. And I have to say, in the aftermath of the war, nobody really seems to have shown antipathy toward William. It's just, it is what it is. The people were divided. So it wasn't that they were saying that she was a Whig because they hated him and he was gone and she was there. It was because that was the way they remembered it. The other thing that I would say that I think is pretty strong circumstantial evidence are her petitions, where she uses the language of rights and citizenship that was very typical, not of the language women used, but of the language that Americans used during the Revolutionary era. And so William goes off to Canada, and when he gets to Canada, he petitions too. He petitions the royal governor of Canada for land, and he's like, I fought with Cornwallis, I'm loyal, blah, 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 blah. And if you read his petitions, they're all this kind of groveling, oh, your majesties, blah, 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 blah. And I'm so helpless and dependent on the king, and all of this kind of stuff that might have served his purpose, although maybe not. If you're running a government or an army, you don't want your men groveling. You kind of want them to be strong and stuff. But I think it really shows a different political worldview. If you read his petition, it is clear he buys into monarchy, he buys into hierarchy, he buys into all of those things that were kind of typical of the way most Americans probably looked at politics before the revolution. Jane's petitions don't, she's angry by the time she gets to her third petition. She's like basically yelling at the most powerful people in North Carolina and saying, look, listen to me, you need to listen to me. And that's not what William's doing, even though he's like a colonel in the Tory militia. So I think I have no idea particularly what her politics were at the beginning of the war, but I think that by the time you get to the 1780s, she's on board. What her reasons for being on board were, does she really believe the rhetoric? Does she just hate William by then and okay, if he's a Tory, I'm a Whig? I don't know.
Well, she definitely has reasons to hate William. And so I want to talk about William after the revolution before ending on Jane and really diving into her experience. So as you hinted, William ends up in Canada, but with somebody else. But there are some incidents that happened before he even leaves for Canada where he runs afoul of the law. Do you want to talk a little bit about his immediate effects?
Yeah, this is the best part of his story. So William, who I know nobody's ever heard of today, but in North Carolina, he was kind of in the top, I guess, 65 most notorious Tories in the state or the colony, depending on how you look at it. those anti-Tory laws that confiscated property, that banished people, that imposed penalties on loyalists, usually included a list of names that said, look, I mean, these laws apply to all of these people, but these are the ones that we hate the most. And he was always on that list, always on the list. It's like obscure Williams. He's on a list with like royal governors and Supreme Court justices. So he was kind of a big deal at the time. So his property is slated for confiscation. He's officially banished, but yet he doesn't go away. There's a really important lesson here. Read the laws, of course, read the laws, but don't believe that what the laws are saying is what's actually happening. William actually ends up staying in North Carolina until 1790, which is like, 7 years after the war is officially over. He is in the first US federal census. And so like what happens to him in between, in 1785, he's like still hanging out in the woods. He's not with Jane, well, he's with some other woman, but he's still hanging out in the woods, and he gets arrested for horse stealing. And horse stealing, among other things, is a capital offense in North Carolina at this time. He is tried, he is found guilty, and he is sentenced to be executed. I mean, I've read the order. But yet he's not. And we don't know why he's not, because there he is. It's, he's back, and he's there in 1790. And so by 1787, he becomes a father yet again. He has another son. But this time, the mother of the son is not Jane. It's this woman named Anne Bedsall Reddick, who is actually a married woman, mother of 5, from Virginia, Quaker. And they sort of, take up with each other, and they end up going off to Canada in 1790, living in Canada as husband and wife. And and so, yeah.
Well, one of the things that you talk about in your book, again, it's a story of the Spurgeons and Jane, but also a story of how their experience is, in some ways, windows into experiences writ large. And you talk about this phenomenon of divorce in the post-revolutionary period.
Yeah. And so my big question is, okay, so like divorce is theoretically possible in places like Virginia and North Carolina, and people petition the legislature to get a divorce. That is how you would do it at that point in time. Neither state had ever granted one. The first North Carolina divorce is in 1794. The first Virginia one, I think, is a couple of years after that. So, that begs the question. I mean, we would be silly to think that people got married and they stayed together forever, all the time, just because there's no such thing as divorce. That, of course, doesn't happen. I mean, my theory is that the war and the sort of disruptions of war kind of made it easier or less obvious for people to escape bad marriages. So William is banished by the state of North Carolina. He has to leave. He doesn't for a while, but he has to leave. Jane doesn't have to leave. And so the question that I'm left with in their case, but also in the case of a lot of other people, was there separation? Was it amicable? Was it consensual? I like to imagine them having a conversation and Jane saying, yep, I'm done. And William saying, yup, me too. And, him scurrying off to Canada with Anne, and Jane saying, okay, fine, I'm here, I got my kids, I want the land, and, we'll kind of see what happens. But I think that in a lot of ways, North Carolina actually passes this awesome law in 1790 where, the preamble basically says, people are running away, and, we don't have a divorce law. So, we're going to kind of make this law that if you don't see your husband or your wife for 7 years, you can consider them dead. And you can just sort of go on with your life. And it's kind of like a common law divorce, right? They don't call it that. They wouldn't call it that. But people have always known that people are like moving all over the place during and after the American Revolution. And what historians have always said is, oh, it's about wanting land. It's about economic mobility. And surely it is about that. But I think for some people, it's also about, you know what, this marriage is done. No one's going to notice if I leave. By the way, I'm actually banished. I'm out of here. I'm taking Anne and we're going to go live happily ever after in Canada.
They were fighting for freedom.
They were fighting for, exactly. Yeah. Freedom from a damn man.
Yeah. Which is a great way to segue into what does happen after Jane, parts ways. She actually has a challenging go of it.
Yeah, and so it's another thing about, the laws, right? Jane should have lost, or the Spurgeons should have lost their property because of William's Toryism. The anti-Tory laws said, and this is true of all the states, I think, that if the man who was the Tory left and the woman stayed behind, she would get 1/3 of the land, which is kind of the same way that the common law treated widows, right? You got 1/3 of your husband's property if he died. And these men who were considered Tories were considered politically dead, right? Jane even uses that language in one of her petitions. And so you would think that the state would have confiscated William's property and Jane would have been fighting for that 1/3 if she didn't get it. As it turned out, the state never confiscated his property. What happened to his property was he was sued in court by people he owed money to. And he wasn't poor. It was just the way the economy worked. You owed, you did everything on credit. And so he was sued in a bunch of lawsuits for money that he owed to other people. But because he was an outlaw, he had no standing, and he couldn't sue the people who owed him money. So he had to pay his debts, but no money was coming in to help him to do that. So Jane is on the verge of homelessness because, William has lost all these lawsuits. And so that's where her petitions come from. And it's very complicated, right? Because she's asking the state, hey, look, guys, you promised people like me a widow's 1/3 of the property. And to a certain extent, the state's hands are tied because the state doesn't have the property. These litigants do. And ultimately, it all turns out okay-ish. After 3 petitions, she actually ends up with 400 acres, which is more than 1/3 of 700 acres, which is what the family owned. I'm not exactly sure how and why that happened. Maybe just after 3 petitions, they wanted to get rid of her, to shut this woman up, give her her land, and let her go.
Yeah, so could you walk us through these 3 petitions? Because they're in some ways the best window into Jane in her life.
They're the only window into Jane. I have basically 4 pieces of direct evidence made by or about Jane, 3 petitions and a tombstone. We had to jump the fence to take a picture of the tombstone. It was totally worth it. Very cool. Very cool. So, all right, so the first petition is in 1785, and I call this her legalistic petition. She basically states her situation and says, look, I know something about the anti-Tory laws, and you guys said that people like me should get 1/3, so I trust you to make things right. Boy, was she wrong. They didn't. And so like that first petition is basically stating what the law says and saying, look, you guys made the laws. I know you're going to follow the laws, so I'm just waiting for my land. Petition is rejected. The second petition comes 3 years later in 1788, and I like to call that the angry petition or the indignant petition. And basically in that petition, she's again citing the law, and she's saying, look, my husband made bad political choices, but I can't believe, and this is more or less a quote, I can't believe it was the intention of the legislature to punish poor women and children for the transgressions of their fathers and husbands. And basically saying, and she gets like all these guys in the neighborhood to sign the petition in support of her. And it's interesting, the guys who support it, some of them are Tories, some of them are Whigs, most of them are just like, I don't want to be involved in this, and insofar as I could tell who these people were. That petition gets a sympathetic reading in the legislature, but it's never really acted on. I mean, again, I think it's because of these complications that the state doesn't have the land. So the final petition in 1791, that's the money petition. That's the one that made me want to write a book about this woman. In this petition, she goes through the whole situation again, and this is where she says, I have always been a good citizen attached to the government, meaning the state government, the revolutionary government. And she also says, what I want is the common rights of other citizens. Which, I mean, doesn't sound like a big deal, but at the time it was. Believe me, I read hundreds of these things. Nobody else says that. Even a lot of men don't say that, right? I mean, if you're petitioning, you're a supplicant. You're an inferior asking for help from like an authority figure. But she says that, and you know, we can talk about in the Q&A exactly what rights she thought that she should have. I mean, I don't think she wanted like the right to vote or anything like that. But that's the one where she really, you know, kind of shows her hand that she sees herself as a member of this political community. And because of that, she thinks the legislators need to pay attention when she's telling them about her problems and when she's asking for some sort of redress of her grievances. It's an awesome document.
Yeah, and you know, the petitions are reproduced in the back of the book, and I decided not to read them until I read all of your book, and then I read them, and I couldn't help but thinking, having read the book, that the third petition was the most authentic.
Yep.
And the second one really plays upon those tropes you were talking about before, where I'm a poor woman, I was harassed throughout the war, you know, I suffered. And the second one, I mean, the third one's a lot more assertive of,
Yep.
I am a good citizen.
She's totally pissed by them.
Yeah.
Oh my God, she's really angry, and she wants them to know it. And I mean, I haven't found anyone sort of commenting on her language. My guess is that they didn't much appreciate it. And I have to say, that last petition was not granted. But like a few months later, there's this mysterious entry in the records of the North Carolina Land Office that basically says, we're giving Jane Spurgin 400 acres, including the place where her house is located. And so I don't know how it happened. They must have gotten together and talked to the litigants who had won these cases and engineered some sort of a swap, or said, you know, look, she's got 13 kids. You know, I don't know how it happened, but it did.
Yeah. So actually, I have one last question, but your answer, I wanted to ask you something on the side. Now I'll ask you in front of everybody. I couldn't help but think, do you think the French Revolution played any influence in her? Because that was swirling around, and the idea of citizenship had been taken on a whole new meaning with, you know, citizen Genet, citizen this person, you know.
Wow. Probably not. I mean, these people lived in the middle of nowhere. You know, I mean, I'm glad we're doing this conversation because this book talk has the most boring PowerPoint ever. It's all words. We don't know what these people looked like. I got the tombstone. The tombstone's awesome. But no, I mean, print culture in North Carolina is not as robust as it would be in, say, Philadelphia or even Williamsburg, right? And so the main newspaper would have been the Raleigh Register, and that's not established until like 1799. So I don't think so. I mean, you know, the language of citizenship is kind of big in the American Revolution too. And I don't think she's really asking for anything terribly radical. You know, Happy Women's History Month. I would love to say that Jane was a feminist or a proto-feminist, but I don't think she was. I think she was just furious. And being in this situation, you know, the revolution sort of politicized her, but not because she was like, you know, radical. It politicized her in the enormous amount of suffering, you know, that she had to endure, that she wouldn't have had to endure if the whole thing had never happened.
Yeah. So I want to bring it now to the end, where there's this really interesting combination of William Spurgeon's family. William Spurgeon goes off to Canada. He has a whole new second family.
Yep.
There's a reunification of sorts later in the West, which itself is an American story in some ways.
Yeah, this is kind of awesome. So Jane's sons, and there are either 6 or 7 of them. The oldest one actually moves to Tennessee, but the second oldest one gets her land, and in fact expands upon that later in life. The other ones move west, and they end up, all of them, at least initially, in the southeastern corner of Indiana, which apparently was a fairly common place for people from North Carolina and to a lesser extent Virginia to go, which I didn't know. I mean, I thought Tennessee, Kentucky, but southeastern Indiana, they end up there, her sons. When William dies in Canada a few years after Jane, his wife, Anne, moves with their sons, and there are 2 of them. They leave Canada, and they also go to the same part of southeastern Indiana. And it gets better. So Anne's husband, Solomon, in other words, the guy who lost his wife to William, he actually does petition for divorce in Virginia, and you can read the divorce petition online. The petition is rejected. But at some point, he takes up with a woman named Amy. And we don't know anything else about her except her name is Amy. And at some point, Amy and Solomon leave Virginia with Solomon and Anne's sons, and they go to, you guessed it, southeastern Indiana. So here is this relatively sparsely populated place full of people from my story, right? You know, and so it's and if you think about it, a lot of these men who moved there would have been abandoned as children by their mother or by their father, and I mean, I can't help but think that, I mean, they had to have known each other. One of the family histories said that they kind of hung out together. I mean, who knows if that was true or not. But I think that the fact that they all kind of went to the same place sort of suggests that maybe the breakup of the Spurgeons' marriage was consensual. And that these people kind of regarded each other as some kind of, weird family connection. And I also go back to what we talked about earlier, going to the backcountry in North Carolina. The good news is the land is cheap. The bad news is it's got to be cleared. We've got to create these farms. And that was one of the reasons why people moved in family groups. And I think that maybe a version of that process is being recreated in southeastern Indiana, where, again, the land is going to be cheaper than in North Carolina, but it's got to be cleared, it's got to be turned into farms, and having people that to help you do that can be really helpful. I don't know if that's true, but I think the odds are that, I mean, how do you just sort of end up there? It's super weird.
That's what I was talking about, all the twists and turns in this book.
It is super weird. And so I don't know, maybe there is a happy-ish ending for these people. I don't know, maybe not.
Yeah. Great. I think there's time for some questions, if there are any. I think, can we ask, because we have people online, if you just want to wait for the microphone. Stephen?
Did Jane write all 3 petitions herself? And that means she was educated? Can you discuss that?
That is a great question. Okay, so petitions are inherently complicated because no matter who you were, you would go to a clerk or a scribe and have your petition physically written by them. Okay, she was literate. To the extent that she could sign her name. I think she was more literate than that because her signature is quite good. And I mean, it's not messy. And also because they were serious Baptists, and Baptists read the Bible. I mean, so, and they weren't Baptist in Maryland. They were Church of England in Maryland. But when they come down to North Carolina, they are part of this Baptist community. And it was really important for them to read the Bible. I know that at least one of her daughters was literate. There are no schools where they live, so clearly this kid had to learn how to read somewhere. And I assume that it was from Jane, and her sons are literate as well. But the petitions are physically written by somebody else. And so the question is always, okay, how much of this is what she's saying, or how much of it is what the clerk is saying, or words that people are putting in her, in her mouth or in his pen, so to speak. And there are parts of these petitions that are very formulaic, that the beginning and the end, that are going to be the same almost no matter who's petitioning. I think that these are authentically her voice for two reasons. First of all, like I said, they're very distinctive. This is not the garden variety petition that people are giving. And secondly, if someone was advising her what to say, they gave her really bad advice. Because this is not the winning argument. If you're a woman in the 18th century, the winning argument is not, it's my right. People aren't really sure what rights women have, or for that matter, in some cases, what rights men have. The winning argument for women is, ooh, I'm a poor, suffering mother of 13 small children, and you are great and powerful men. Please help me. And so, like, if she was getting advice, she was getting really stupid advice. But I think it was her. I mean, I kind of like to imagine, like the men in the room saying, Jane, you need to say you're poor and weak, and her saying, well, the hell with that. This is what I want to say. So.
I'm curious, you mentioned some of Jane's family are connected with the Regulator movement. Do we know if her husband is drawing on any of those connections? Are any of them end up in that militia with him? Or is he sort of the only one in that family group that we know gets involved on the British side?
That's a really good question. As far as I can tell, okay, so her name was Welborn, okay, Jane Welborn Spurgin. As far as I can tell, the Welborn men they tried to stay out of it as much as they could. They just, I'm thinking that they're paying for substitutes. There is no record of them fighting at all on either side, which is kind of weird, but I really couldn't find any evidence of them fighting on either side. The only other member of the family who is involved in a military way is both of William's brothers, one of whom by this time had moved to South Carolina. But his brothers also fight for the king. But they're not justices of the peace or anything like that. But I mean, the Welborns are a really good example of what I think most regulators did, which is just kind of leave me alone. I've had enough. I'm certainly not going to support these people who made my life miserable. And why would I fight for the king? If not that they actually really liked the last royal governor of North Carolina, who was very sort of solicitous of the regulators' grievances, right? But I think a lot of people think that the regulators supported the revolution because the most important regulator, who was this guy named Herman Husband, he was like the voice of the movement. He does become an important revolutionary. But he's unusual in that regard, I think.
During the war, after her husband left, how did she support herself? I mean, she has 700 plus acres. She has 13 kids, none of whom are very old.
Well, some of them would have been old enough.
But managing 700, almost 800 acres is a lot of work.
Yeah, it
How did she make a living?
Yeah, it is. Okay, so she did have some older sons who maybe 3 of them would have been able to help. She had all these brothers who were like living in the area. And as I said, they had either 1 or 2 enslaved men working for them. So there are mentions of 2 different names. One is Neil, I think the other one is Simon. In like one of her petitions, she actually asks to get the one guy back because he had been taken for dead or something like that. And so I don't think they ever had 2 slaves at the same time, but I think that they did have access to some bonded labor. I mean, the other thing is that that the 700 acres, I have no idea exactly how much of that was being cultivated for crops. So, I mean, they had an orchard, right, where they would have had like apple trees to make cider and things like that. They would have had a pasture where, they had cattle for like dairying. I don't know how much of the land was actually under cultivation. So, I mean, I guess, the way she made a living was continuing with the help of other people and neighbors, right? I mean, there is this core of this Abbott's Creek, which is the area in North Carolina that she lived in, the Abbott's Creek Baptist Church, where these people, a lot of them had migrated south from Maryland together. And so, they go back generations, there's sort of connections. And I think, neighborliness would have been really important, particularly since, again, a lot of these people in this neighborhood apparently did everything they could to avoid going off to war. So there were men around, just not her man, Yeah.
So I saw maybe the last question back there, and before the mic gets there, I want to ask you another question,
Okay.
Which is, you mentioned some family histories. Have you had any interactions with genealogists? Are the family descendants aware of this book?
I have gotten emails from, I would say, maybe 8 people who their descendants. Well, in this, okay, if you have 13 kids, obviously your family's going to get, and the youngest son in this family, the second one who was married, who was born during the war, dies in 1860, and he dies in Nevada. So, he goes to southeastern Indiana, he moves to Illinois, he's in Missouri at one point, and he ends up, way far west. So these people are everywhere.
Was he a Mormon? You mentioned it was a Mormon community, you're not sure?
I don't know if he was a Mormon.
Okay.
He was at that Nauvoo,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I don't know. I know that at various times he said he was a preacher, he said he was a physician. That's a little scary, right? It's like, oh yes, I'm a physician. It's like, oh yeah, really? I don't think so. I mean, early American medicine is just scary by definition.
Especially on the frontier.
Exactly. So, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I have heard from some of them, and it's like, one of the great things about doing early American history is all the people you write about are dead. I mean, like really, really dead, really dead. And so it's like you're not going to get emails from them, right? But the problem, the problem and the great opportunity with a book like this is obviously the people in the book are dead, but they have so many descendants, and and I'm like, oh my God, I hope I didn't get anything wrong. And so far I haven't, so that's cool.
Well, I just didn't know with a family like that if there was even oral histories or anything like that they shared with you after the fact when they saw an ancestor in this book, or?
Yeah, not really so much that. And in fact, I mean, so like the son who gets the land, his name is Joseph, and he becomes a state senator in North Carolina. He actually does write a little kind of memoir when he's an old man in the 1850s, and he writes about his parents. And I don't like Joseph, because what he says is and so this is like, historical memory, right? He remembers his father. This is the guy who like ran off and abandoned the family. as being like an honorable man, and like he was a Tory, but he couldn't break his oath, and therefore, he was an honorable man. And the way he remembers his mother, the only way he remembers his mother, who is the whole reason why he has all this land in the first place, is he just remembers his mom as kind of being a nag. Like, William, do you really need to be a Tory? We're going to get in so much trouble. As opposed to like kind of remembering that she was as much a Whig as he was a Tory. And more important, she was the one who got the family land that he was able to have and kind of pass on to his children and all of that.
There's a very different depiction in that Carruthers history that's also included in the back of this book about her during the Revolution. And I'll just tease that for everyone so they can buy this book and find out for themselves. Last question.
Thank you. I was looking at the illustration in your book of the Great Wagon Road and trying to figure out its location. Does it track any current day highways or byways?
Oh, I was going to say Route 81, and I usually do say Route 81 because people know where that is, but even more so Route 11, which is kind of the older version of where Route 81 is and kind of parallel to that. So we're talking about on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains, but pretty close to the mountains. So places like Frederick, Maryland, Harrisonburg, Stanton, places like that in Virginia, and down into the place that they lived in Rowan County, which is now part of Davidson County, is it's close to High Point, North Carolina, where that is today. Because the way we found the grave, anybody here use findagrave.com? Isn't that awesome? I mean, the name is like the best part, right? And so anyway, her tombstone is on Find a Grave. And so a friend of mine and I, Google Maps, it's like, okay, we're going to find this. It's like, oh, it's near High Point. Yeah.
Well, thank you for this great conversation, and thank you for this great book, Cindy.
Thank you, Pat. Thanks for coming.
And the book is available for sale, and you'll be here to sign as well?
I will.
Great.
Sure. Absolutely. Can we take the tape off?
Yeah, I know.
Ow.